The heavy iron bells of the Church of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois began to toll ominously in the dark pre-dawn hours of August 24, 1572. This sound was not a call to prayer, but a signaled command that would unleash a torrent of violence across the city of Paris. Inside the royal palace, the Queen Mother Catherine de Medici waited with bated breath as the soldiers she had assembled prepared to execute a grim duty. The narrow cobblestone streets below were silent for only a moment longer before the shouting began. Men with white crosses on their hats moved swiftly through the shadows, clutching swords and pikes, ready to strike down their neighbors in the name of faith. Chaos erupted instantly as the Swiss Guard and Catholic militias breached the homes of prominent Protestant leaders who had gathered in the capital for a royal wedding. Doors were smashed open with axes, and the unsuspecting occupants were dragged from their beds into the unforgiving night. The air filled with the metallic clash of steel and the terrified screams of those who realized too late that they had walked into a trap. This was not merely a political purge, but a release of years of pent-up religious hatred that had been simmering beneath the surface of French society. The stone walls of Paris bore silent witness to a betrayal that would stain the reputation of the monarchy for centuries. The stakes of this conflict were nothing less than the soul and survival of France itself as a unified nation-state. The kingdom was tearing itself apart from the inside as two rival interpretations of Christianity vied for absolute dominance over the population. On one side stood the entrenched Catholic majority supported by the Pope and the powerful monarchy, which viewed religious dissent as treason against the crown. On the other side were the Huguenots, who were French Protestants inspired by the teachings of John Calvin and desperate for the freedom to worship without fear of persecution. The collision of these two irresistible forces threatened to dissolve the nation into a collection of warring feudal states. At the center of this maelstrom stood Catherine de Medici, a woman of immense intellect and steely determination, who was fighting to preserve the Valois dynasty. As the widow of King Henry II and the mother to three successive kings of France, she wielded power in a world dominated by ambitious men. Catherine was a pragmatist who often sought peace through negotiation and marriage alliances, but she was also capable of ruthless decisions when she felt the authority of her sons was threatened. She navigated a treacherous path between the fanatical Catholic League and the rebellious Huguenot lords, always prioritizing the stability of the throne above all else. The question that haunted every citizen of France, from the humblest peasant to the highest noble, was whether the kingdom could survive such deep division. Could a nation exist with two religions, or would one side inevitably have to exterminate the other to ensure peace? The conflicts known as the Wars of Religion would drag on for decades, claiming millions of lives through combat, famine, and disease. They would see the assassination of kings, the destruction of ancient cathedrals, and the intervention of foreign powers eager to capitalize on French weakness. The answer to the question of survival would only come after the soil of France was thoroughly soaked in the blood of its own people. The rise of Protestantism in France had begun quietly decades earlier, with intellectuals and artisans adopting the ideas of the Reformation. By the middle of the 16th century, however, the movement had spread to the nobility, including powerful princes of the blood who saw in Calvinism a chance to regain feudal autonomy. The spread of these ideas challenged the divine right of the Catholic kings and created a state within a state. The Huguenots established their own fortified cities and gathered armies commanded by experienced generals. This militarization of religious difference turned theological disputes into open warfare, where the Bible was quoted to justify slaughter. King Henry II had been a staunch persecutor of the Huguenots, establishing special courts to try heretics and burn them at the stake. However, his sudden and accidental death in a jousting tournament in 1559 left a dangerous power vacuum. His sickly 15-year-old son Francis II ascended the throne, but he was merely a puppet for the ambitious Guise family. The Duke of Guise and his brother, the Cardinal of Lorraine, were fervent Catholics who seized control of the government and intensified the persecution of Protestants. Their aggressive policies alienated many moderate nobles and pushed the Huguenots closer to armed rebellion. The tension reached a breaking point with the Amboise conspiracy, where a group of Protestant nobles plotted to kidnap the young King Francis II to free him from the influence of the Guise family. The plot was discovered and the retribution was swift and brutal. The conspirators were hunted down and executed with their bodies hung from the ramparts of the Château d'Amboise as a grim warning to others. This event marked the transition from persecution to political conspiracy, setting the stage for open military conflict. It demonstrated that the religious divide had become inextricably linked with the struggle for political power at the highest levels. When Francis II died prematurely from an ear infection, his younger brother Charles IX became king at the tender age of 10. Catherine de Medici assumed the role of regent and attempted to steer a middle course, issuing the Edict of Saint Germain, which granted limited toleration to the Huguenots. She hoped that by allowing Protestants to worship publicly outside of walled towns, she could diffuse the tension and restore order. However, this policy of moderation enraged the radical Catholics who viewed any concession to heresy as an insult to God. The atmosphere in the country remained toxic and volatile, waiting for a single spark to ignite the powder keg. That spark came in March 1562 at the town of Vassy, where the Duke of Guise was passing through with his armed escort. They encountered a group of Huguenots holding a religious service in a barn which the Duke claimed was illegal. An argument ensued and quickly escalated into violence, resulting in the massacre of dozens of unarmed worshippers. The massacre of Vassy sent shockwaves through the Protestant community and convinced them that they could no longer trust royal edicts for protection. The Huguenot leader Louis de Bourbon, Prince of Condé, called his followers to arms, and the First War of Religion officially began. The early years of the war were characterized by a series of inconclusive battles and sieges that devastated the French countryside. Foreign powers were quick to intervene, with Queen Elizabeth I of England sending money and troops to support the Huguenots, while Philip II of Spain backed the Catholics. The conflict became a proxy war for the greater religious struggle consuming Europe. Great commanders on both sides fell in battle, including the King of Navarre and the Duke of Guise himself, who was assassinated by a Protestant nobleman. Despite the violence, neither side could deliver a knockout blow, leading to a series of fragile truces. Catherine de Medici continued her desperate efforts to broker a lasting peace, arranging a grand tour of the kingdom for her son Charles IX to instill loyalty in his subjects. She also arranged a marriage between her daughter Margaret of Valois and the young Protestant leader Henry of Navarre. This union was intended to be a symbol of reconciliation that would unite the two warring factions in bonds of kinship. The wedding was set to take place in Paris in August 1572, drawing the entire leadership of the Huguenot party to the staunchly Catholic capital. It was a gamble of enormous proportions. The atmosphere in Paris during the wedding festivities was thick with tension and hostility. The Parisian population was overwhelmingly Catholic, and they looked upon the influx of black-clad Protestant nobles with suspicion and hatred. Fiery preachers took to the pulpits denouncing the marriage as an unholy abomination and urging the faithful to cleanse the city of heretics. In this heated environment, an assassination attempt was made on Admiral Coligny, the most respected military leader of the Huguenots. He was shot in the street, but survived his wounds, causing panic and outrage among his followers. Fearing a Huguenot uprising in revenge for the attack on Coligny, the Royal Council held an emergency meeting. They convinced the impressionable King Charles IX that the Protestants were plotting to seize the palace and kill the royal family. In a moment of panic, or perhaps coerced by his mother and the Guise faction, the king shouted that if they were to kill the admiral, they must kill all the Huguenots so that none would be left to reproach him. The order was given to close the city gates and arm the militia. The stage was set for the tragedy of St. Bartholomew Day. The massacre that followed remains one of the darkest chapters in French history. Admiral Coligny was murdered in his bedchamber, and his body was thrown out of the window to the mob below, where it was mutilated. The violence spread like wildfire as common citizens joined the soldiers in hunting down their Protestant neighbors. Men, women, and children were slaughtered without mercy, and their bodies were piled in the streets or thrown into the Seine River, which reportedly ran red with blood. The killing lasted for weeks, spreading from Paris to other cities across France, resulting in the deaths of thousands. Henry of Navarre, the bridegroom whose wedding had brought the victims to Paris, was spared only because he was a prince of the blood. He was brought before the king and forced to convert to Catholicism on pain of death. Held as a prisoner at the royal court for several years, Henry bided his time, outwardly practicing the Catholic faith while secretly maintaining contact with his supporters. His survival was crucial, for he possessed a charisma and political acumen that would eventually make him the most important figure in the conflict. He watched and learned as the Valois monarchy slowly crumbled under the weight of its own crimes. The massacre did not destroy the Huguenot movement as Catherine had hoped, but instead radicalized it. The survivors lost all faith in the monarchy and organized themselves into an independent political resistance in the south and west of France. They created a federal republic in all but name, with its own tax system and army. The Fourth War of Religion erupted almost immediately, with the royal army laying siege to the Protestant stronghold of La Rochelle. The defenders fought with the courage of those who have nothing left to lose, repelling repeated assaults and forcing the king to sign yet another peace treaty. King Charles IX did not long survive the horrors he had authorized. Haunted by nightmares and physically wasting away, he died in 1574, leaving the throne to his brother Henry III. The new king was intelligent and cultured, but also eccentric and deeply unpopular. He surrounded himself with a group of young male favorites known as the Mignons, which scandalized the court. Henry III found himself in an impossible position, caught between the vengeful Huguenots and the newly formed Catholic League, which was funded by Spain and led by the ambitious Henry, Duke of Guise. The Catholic League was a populist movement that viewed Henry III as too lenient towards heretics. They demanded the complete eradication of Protestantism and challenged the authority of the king. The Duke of Guise became the idol of the Parisian mobs, who hailed him as the true defender of the faith. This three-way power struggle between the king, the Huguenots led by Henry of Navarre, who had escaped court and returned to Protestantism, and the Catholic League became known as the War of the Three Henrys. It was the final and most destructive phase of the religious wars. As the power of the Catholic League grew, Henry III found his authority evaporating. In May 1588, the citizens of Paris rose up in rebellion during the Day of the Barricades, blocking the streets with chains and furniture to trap the royal troops. The king was forced to flee his own capital, leaving the city in the hands of the Duke of Guise. Humiliated and desperate, Henry III realized that as long as the Duke lived, he would never be master of his own kingdom. He resolved to take drastic action to eliminate his rival. The king summoned the Duke of Guise to a meeting at the Château de Blois under the pretense of discussing state business. As the Duke entered the king's chamber, he was set upon by the royal bodyguards and stabbed to death. The king stepped out from behind a curtain to view the body of his enemy, reportedly remarking on how tall he looked in death. The assassination of the popular Duke outraged the Catholic League, and the Pope excommunicated Henry III. The king now had no choice but to ally himself with his cousin and former enemy Henry of Navarre. The two Henrys joined forces and marched on Paris, intending to retake the capital from the League. However, the cycle of violence continued when a fanatical monk named Jacques Clement gained entry to the royal camp. Claiming to have a secret message for the king, he approached Henry III and plunged a knife into his abdomen. The last Valois king died without a male heir, and on his deathbed, he named Henry of Navarre as his successor. The Protestant leader was now officially King Henry IV of France, but his kingdom was in ruins and his capital refused to open its gates. Henry IV faced a daunting task. He was a Protestant king claiming the throne of a predominantly Catholic country that was occupied by Spanish troops and ruled by a radical religious militia. He spent the next 4 years fighting for his crown, displaying brilliant military leadership at the battles of Arques and Ivry. He rallied his troops with the famous cry to follow his white plume, which would always be found on the path to honor and victory. Despite his battlefield successes, Paris remained stubbornly close to him, enduring a horrific siege, where starvation drove citizens to eat rats and leather. Realizing that military force alone could not unite the kingdom, Henry IV made a pragmatic and historic decision. He understood that the vast majority of his subjects would never accept a Protestant monarch. In July 1593, he announced his intention to convert to Catholicism, famously striving to heal the nation wounds. While the quote "Paris is well worth a mass" is likely apocryphal, it perfectly captures the spirit of his decision. He placed the welfare of the state above personal religious dogma, choosing to be a king for all Frenchmen rather than a leader of a faction. Henry's conversion broke the back of the Catholic League resistance. Cities that had opposed him now opened their gates, and he entered Paris in triumph in March 1594. He did not seek revenge against his former enemies, but instead offered amnesty and bribes to win their loyalty. He famously said that he had no enemies among the French people, only among the enemies of France. His focus turned to driving out the Spanish armies that still occupied parts of the country and restoring the borders of the kingdom. With the foreign invaders expelled and the internal rebellion quelled, Henry IV turned to the most difficult task of all, which was establishing a lasting religious peace. In 1598, he issued the Edict of Nantes, a landmark document that granted the Huguenots substantial rights. It allowed them freedom of conscience, the right to worship in specific locations, and the ability to hold public office. It also allowed them to maintain a number of fortified towns for their own protection. It was not total religious freedom in the modern sense, but it was a revolutionary step towards tolerance in a Europe torn by sectarian violence. The Edict of Nantes brought an end to nearly 40 years of civil war. Henry IV dedicated the rest of his reign to rebuilding the shattered economy and infrastructure of France. He promoted agriculture, built roads and canals, and encouraged industry. He was known as the Good King Henry, and his goal was to ensure that every peasant in his kingdom could afford a chicken in their pot on Sundays. Under his rule, France began to recover its strength and prestige, laying the foundations for the absolute monarchy of the next century. However, the hatreds of the past were not easily extinguished. There were still those who viewed Henry as a heretic and a traitor to the true faith. On May 14, 1610, while his carriage was stuck in traffic in a narrow Paris street, a fanatic named Francois Ravaillac leaped onto the wheel and stabbed the king to death. The assassination plunged the nation into mourning, but the peace Henry had built proved strong enough to survive him. He had saved France from destruction and set it on a path to becoming the dominant power in Europe. The wars of religion in France serve as a stark reminder of the dangers of extremism and the fragility of social order. They demonstrated how quickly a civilized society can descend into barbarism when political ambition is fueled by religious intolerance. The decades of violence left deep scars on the French collective memory, influencing the development of the state and its relationship with the church for centuries to come. The conflict ultimately proved that national unity could not be based on enforced religious uniformity, but required a strong central state capable of arbitrating between different factions. The legacy of this turbulent era is visible today in the architecture of French cities and the cultural identity of the nation. The struggle between Catholic and Protestant shaped the intellectual landscape, leading to debates on the nature of authority and the rights of the individual. The Edict of Nantes stands as a monument to the idea that people of different faiths can live together in the same country, even if that coexistence is uneasy. It was a hard-won lesson learned through the suffering of millions. From the tolling bells of Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois to the signing of the peace treaty, the story of the French wars of religion is one of human tragedy and resilience. It is a narrative filled with larger-than-life characters who were driven by faith, ambition, and fear. In the end, the survival of France depended not on the victory of one religion over the other, but on the triumph of political wisdom over sectarian hatred. The whispers of that time still echo in the history of the modern world, warning us of the cost when dialogue fails and violence becomes the only language.